Hi, Jennifer Stuart here, and I'm so excited to be chatting with Virginia Spielmann today as part of my Peace and Joy Parenting Interview Series. And I wanted to quickly introduce Virginia to you guys. She has an extensive list of many accomplishments with children and therapy. And Virginia is currently an Associate Director of the STAR Institute for Sensory Processing Disorder. She's a clinical consultant and an the Interdisciplinary Council on Development and Learning. Virginia was trained in occupational therapy at Oxford Brookes University in England. We'll hear that in her accent today. She completed her master's in occupational therapy in the USA and is studying for her PhD in infant and early childhood development with an emphasis on mental health with Fielding Graduate University in Santa Barbara. So she's a well-traveled speaker, coach, and educator on topics including sensory integration, DIR Floortime, child development, and infant mental health. She's conducted trainings all around the world and in the US. She has 20 years of experience working in pediatrics. That's a long time. That's about how long I've been working with kids. And her extensive pediatric experience includes children on the autism spectrum, as well as those with sensory processing disorder, infant mental health issues, children from adopted families, and those who have experienced developmental trauma. So that's just part of her list of her amazing background. So hi, Virginia, how are you today?
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks so much for having me and reading that long list out.
Yes, well, I only covered part of it, so Virginia is amazing. So I wanted to have Virginia on here to help parents understand more about what in the world is sensory processing to begin with, because I think a lot of people still are not really educated on that yet. So.
Right, and sensory processing is sounds a little bit mysterious, but it's very much an established part of how we develop as human beings. We experience the world through our sensory systems, and this starts in utero when we are forming inside our mother's womb. We start to experience the world through our senses, and our senses and our emotions are very much intertwined and wrapped up in each other. So we feel the world around us. How are you feeling? And that really, can refer to an emotional state as well as a sensory state. So it's when you might say sensory processing and people do a double take. What is that? It's that thing we're doing all the time, every day.
Right,
and we do and when it's working well, we don't really think about it, but all of us experience times of fatigue or overwhelm when suddenly our sensory processing isn't working too great. And we jump at a sound, or we start to get a little bit vigilant about the noises and the images around us. Maybe we're in that car park at night and it's dark, and our nervous system is starting to think maybe there's a threat nearby, and then we become really aware of our sensory processing. So it should really be something that's effortless and doesn't take up conscious brain space, and that's what functional sensory processing looks like. It looks invisible.
Sure. And then obviously there's children and adults that have some issues in that developmental area, right?
Right, totally. When we talk about sensory processing, often what we talk about is modulation, and that's how much we react to the sensory events of the world around us and our internal sensory systems. But there are other aspects of sensory processing too that we can really struggle with, and we can talk about that. You might have to bring me back to that later, but that first piece is our responsivity or our reactivity to the sensations of the world and our internal body. And so are we overreactive or are we underreactive? And also we can react in different ways to different sensory systems. Sure. And so we're not just talking about the five senses that we learn about in elementary school, which drives most OTs crazy. Occupational therapists around the world pull their hair out when the 5 senses get taught in school, because there are 8. And it's not, The Sixth Sense was a great movie, but it was confusing. So The Sixth Sense really, there's taste, smell, sound, touch, and vision. Those are the typical 5 senses that we might think about when we're talking about how we experience the world. But there's also our sense of where we are in relation to gravity. And so we have this gravity sensing hardware inside our head right here. It's liquid, and it's in the ear, liquid and membranes that move and tell the brain where our head is in relation to the pavement, the sidewalk.
And that one has the fancy name, right?
That's the vestibular system.
Vestibular system. Okay.
That's the vestibular system. And so that's your gravity sensing system, and it's kind of the air traffic control for all the other systems too. And so that system is super important and gets very little attention, and we'd all love it to be taught in elementary school along with the other 5 systems, as well as your proprioceptive system. And the receptors for your proprioceptive system, they're generally in your joints and your muscle spindles. And when you get compression on a joint or traction on a joint, you get deep proprioceptive information, more intense proprioceptive information. So this is how you know, if you're not looking, where your hand is in relation to your forearm, in relation to your upper arm, where your foot is, which leg's crossed over the other leg, and so on. So there's a little bit of tactile in that, but there's a lot of proprioception. And when you have good proprioceptive integration, I mean, most Olympic athletes have good proprioceptive, very well integrated proprioceptive systems. It also tells you how quickly or slowly to extend muscles or contract muscles. And so that's force regulation. How hard are you going to shut that drawer or that door? When you pick up something and you expect it to be heavy, but it's light, child, often my 8-year-old is super light, but he's 8, so you think he's going to be hard to pick up, and you can overshoot because you have this anticipatory proprioceptive data that tells you how much you're going to have to use your muscles for this job.
Sure.
And you can imagine if that system is going awry, what that means in the classroom or in the early years of life. And the kid who looks like he's rough all the time and is being really mean to the cat or whatever, and that might be, he just doesn't know how much force he's using. He doesn't have a good sense of that system.
I've seen that a lot with little kids.
Right. And then the final one is the interoceptive sensations that we have that tell us if we're hungry, thirsty, need to use the restroom, if our heart is beating, racing, and all those really important data from our internal organs and those sensations. And so some of our children can again be over or under responsive to those inputs, and adults too, and that can be really important as well. And they're doing research into eating disorders, depression and anxiety, and how much people are able to integrate information from their interoceptive system. So that's 3 really long words, which is why it doesn't get taught in elementary school, but fundamental pieces of child development that really it would be great if everyone was aware of, from the kindergarten teacher to the family pediatrician and so on.
Or to the soccer coach, to anybody.
Brilliant. Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, for sure. And so one of the questions I think I actually haven't asked anyone, but now you've got me thinking, are there some sensory areas that tend to that you guys see have more issues with kids than others, or is it all kind of even across the board? Or
so if we're talking about just over responsivity and under responsivity, then I would say we do a lot of our work in the tactile, vestibular, proprioceptive systems. There's a lot of visual work as well. Those are the systems that really impact your ability to make a motor plan. And so that's another area of sensory processing that we look at. And so does a child have developmental coordination challenges that are sensory based, or postural challenges, keeping themselves up against gravity? So that's really the job of the first couple of years of life, is mastering gravity. But some kids still haven't won that fight with gravity, and gravity's still in charge, and they're the kids who like to have as much of themselves in contact with the floor or the furniture as possible.
Yeah.
Right. And they don't sit at the table, they have their whole upper half of their body on the table or wrapped around the table, or they can't even sit, they have to stand because that inner team of core muscles isn't working. And so we call those sensory based motor disorders in those kids. They can be postural, or they can be about motor planning and coordination of the body. And so along with those sensory systems, the other one I think we see a lot is auditory. And so auditory over responsivity or under responsivity, or just that discrimination piece. And then that's the next tier when we're looking at reactivity, we're looking at sensory-based motor disorders, and then we start thinking about, well, this child gets it, they hear it, they see it, they register it, but they don't know what it means and they don't know what to do with it. And so then we might start thinking about that piece, the final icing on the cake of sensory integration, where you can interpret the sensation correctly and make sense of it. And so again, it's those systems, it's that visual, auditory, proprioceptive, vestibular, your equilibrium sense.
Yeah, so it sounds like they probably, a lot of kids will often have more than one area that they're struggling with.
I honestly think it's highly unlikely that a child would have a single sensory system that needs attention on it, in the same way that I think it's highly unlikely that a child would just have difficulty with reflex integration. The human body is made of all of these systems that interact with each other, and they have to work well together. And so, there's this knock-on effect, there's this cascading effect, and especially in the sensory system. So if there's an issue in one system, it's probably going to have impacted other systems. And it might be that you can hone in and say, look, it's really vestibular here, and if we do the majority of our work here, that's going to be great. But really, you would want to always be thinking about the bigger picture as well, and the interaction between these pieces.
Sure. And then, so what would you recommend parents be on the lookout for? Because I mean, sometimes as a parent, you think, oh, they're just, acting out when they're squishing the cat or laying on the table, or,
Right, and it often looks like behaviors. Yeah. So we really talk about behavior as communication.
Okay.
And so rather than just, wanting to shape a behavior or extinguish a behavior, we're asking, why is the behavior happening? What is this behavior telling us about this child? And for the child who responds very angrily to the school bell and always has an incident around that time, if you're looking at that child as a detective, then you're hopefully going to be able to identify some patterns and start to say, when there are loud noises, he puts his hands over his ears and he says something rude, which, we've tried telling him off and that's not working. And B, it takes him about half an hour, sometimes an hour or two, to come back to himself afterwards. So what is it with noise? Is there something here? Or that child who's lazy, like, everyone goes for a walk and all the other 3-year-olds are walking, and this one needs to lie down on the grass and can't move. Well, maybe this child isn't mastering gravity because there's a sensory-based issue here. So instead of just seeing behaviors, we see behaviors as the tip of the iceberg, and we try to say, what's underneath there that's the main body of this that's really causing what's going on. So you'd look for overreactivity, underreactivity, you'd certainly postural issues. There's the classic tiptoe walking, the breath holding in order to recruit stability and move around. The child who can't ride their bike and was late with their gross motor milestones. You'd want to be looking at sensory-based questions for all of those things as well.
Sure. And then it sounds like you're looking for patterns. So not like one time they have a fit about something, but when you start noticing a reaction over and over again, you start to question.
Yeah. That's when you put your detective's cap on.
Yeah.
To be a sensory Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah. Well, parenting is often that way in many regards.
Exactly, right?
Definitely. And then what do you guys think is the major causes for SPD sensory processing issues? Do you think that it's mostly genetic or environmental or quite a mix of both? Or?
So, again, it's a huge mixture. There isn't one single cause. So what we know now is that disordered sensory processing can exist on its own outside of any other diagnoses. And there's a researcher called Elissa Marco who's really looked at the brain differences in children who have disordered sensory processing and no other diagnosis. And there are biological differences in their brains. And so then you're thinking, well, that's a genetic predisposition. There's some sensitivity there in this child. But then there are children who, most individuals on the autism spectrum, and I haven't met one who doesn't have disordered sensory processing and benefit from at least understanding better how their sensory systems work, and at most an intensive therapeutic program with considerable adaptations. And it's also really common in attention deficit disorder population, the twice exceptional gifted population, and then you can have experiences causing sensory challenges. And so trauma or neglect can cause disordered brain development, which causes sensory challenges that would benefit from examination.
Sure.
So, the answer is anything and everything, but what you want is a team of people who are really going to take that broad perspective and look at the child and be those detectives. And we don't, even when we see that it's a genetic diagnosis like Fragile X or something else, we also don't need to take a fatalistic approach. Like, we know what the cause is, but we also know that the brain has endless possibility. Neuroplasticity is a wonderful thing. And that with relationships, support, regulation, and the right input, that brains can really change.
Sure. And what are some things that parents of young children can do to on their own, before maybe they have a more of a milder case, things that they can help their kids with on their own to help them develop in those different sensory areas? I don't know, because I guess I feel like sensory processing is something that's good for all kids, and I think there are definitely levels of it.
Totally agree. Yeah.
So I don't know if you have some, advice. Like, I definitely noticed that kids who have a lot more movement in general or during the day and have good control over that are also, have better time with getting along with the other children and learning in the classroom. And I don't know if you have some general.
Well, I mean, really generally speaking, we do know that every child needs to move, and that recess really, we need more and not less, so shouldn't be taken away as a punishment, and that wherever possible, we minimize screen time and maximize time outdoors, and get our kids moving in big ways wherever possible, and building dens and swinging and going to the park and running down the hill and jumping in muddy puddles, climbing trees, obviously being safe the whole time, completely safe, but experiencing those big body sensations. Multi-sensory sensations are great. So where we're moving and we're feeling our skin and we're maybe having a conversation or singing a song, we're doing things with lots of sensory systems at once. Sure. And then if we know, when we start seeing patterns in our children, and we know that a child is over-responding at a neurological level to sensory input, desensitization isn't going to be the thing that works there. So just exposing them to it until they get over it is probably going to get their neurological system really even more haywire, all the alarms going off. So we want to support our children to be calm and available and feel safe in the world. And so thinking about that from a sensory perspective, does that mean that we warn them before we put the blender on in the morning so that they can, be calm through the noise rather than shock them, so that we think they can just get over it, those sorts of things. And having a routine and having predictability, good for every child. So, I think those sorts of pieces are just respectful, developmental parenting concepts applied to the sensory domain.
Sure. Yeah, no, and I like that you said it's important to realize that just exposing them over and over again to something that is making them upset is not going to fix it. Because I think, you know, sometimes as a parent, you think, oh, just get over it, right?
Right.
Like, nobody
Be
else is
logical.
bothered
Be a
by
grown-up. Yeah. But, you know, their neurological system, if they're having going into some sort of self-protective, defensive, or fight or flight state in response to a sensory event, which does happen within typical development as well as when
Sure.
sensory processing is more disordered, then their brain is not in a place to learn and adapt. And what we want are flexible brains that can habituate to environments and stay in a problem-solving mode even when things are stressful. That's what we want to cultivate in our children. So
Sure.
pushing that button again and again and again and keeping the alarms going is usually counterproductive.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's a good point. And I'm also curious if you guys have noticed an increase in any of these issues with the use of, you know, the more pervasive use of technology now, or if you think that it's still around the same. I mean, I don't know. I feel like that, you know, as a teacher that it seems like I notice a bit more now that I feel like kids are not moving as much.
Right, and I think that's the key. I'm very pro responsible use of technology. I think of Mr. Rogers and how he saw the potential in the television, and there's so much potential for technology to be beneficial and for us to learn to use it responsibly. But when we use it to anesthetize our children and keep them still and stationary, and our children are in their strollers and their car seats and lying on the couch for longer and longer periods, or it's being used at dinner time to keep them quiet, they're not learning fundamental developmental skills like anything from holding a conversation in a noisy room to being able to organize my body through sensory experiences. So I think it's more complicated than just being screens, but certainly the combination of screens and other issues is a challenge. And you might have noticed a theme. I'm always saying it's more complicated than that. That's one of my mantras.
Well, no, I'm sure we're only going to be able to touch on the tip of the iceberg today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, I think definitely screens. And then also I noticed, you know, it seems like parents are often afraid now to let their kids play outside more, to be on large playgrounds. I mean, I've noticed a lot of playgrounds in the communities where I'm at, they've been taking away the swings and taking away this and that because, you know, it's dangerous or there's going to be lawsuits or I think
it really serves us well to be thinking about how our children can get these big movement experiences and learn how to take risks in the safest way possible.
Sure. And then it's okay to touch dirt and things like that.
Please. Yeah.
Sometimes I notice that too. It's like, it's okay. They'll be okay. They can get cleaned afterwards.
And you need to be okay with it too as a parent, right? Like, sometimes the parent will be like, no, you can do it. And then I can't touch it because it's too much. And so sometimes as parents, we teach our children our own sort of anxieties and phobias.
Well, yeah, no, I think it is. Sometimes the parents are afraid, you know, of the germs or something. Like that. So, yeah, for sure. So now, if a parent's noticing that their child is, you know, having issues, I guess at what point should a parent go and seek professional help? You know, when do they know, okay, this is more than just a mild problem here?
I usually think it's a good idea to trust your gut as a parent. And so I'll often say, you know, most occupational therapists will do a screening at least.
Okay.
And so you could do a screening questionnaire. If your pediatrician's, you know, keyed up on sensory processing, you could just ask at your next appointment. Those sorts of things. You can get educated. There are books and free podcasts. There are some on the STAR Institute's website, the SPD University website. There are some free things for parents there and checklists that you can look at. And so, you know, you should be able to tier the feedback that you get. But the only caution I would really say is, you know, find someone who is up to date on what sensory integration and sensory processing is and looks like when it's disordered.
Sure. And I mean, how do people find, because where you're working for, it's just based out of Denver, Colorado?
Right, we're in Denver, and people do travel from all over the US and the world to come and spend time with us here. But we also train therapists, and so if you go to our website, you can look at our directory and find people who've done our training, and that, you know, their name is there, and you can find them in your local area. You could also Google occupational therapists who've been trained in AYRS, sensory integration, AYRES, or DIR, Floortime, or both preferably.
Okay.
Those are sort of the key markers I'd be looking for.
Okay. And I'm kind of curious, I think, since we have a little bit more time, if I often see, I mean, when you're talking about different issues with kids, some of the ones I see the biggest thing of with the children I work with are the sensory seekers, or the deep touch seekers who are crashing and banging into things. What sorts of things do you guys do to help kids with those kinds of issues?
I mean, what you really want to do is you want to look at what's causing that need for that deep pressure input. And so it could be anything from the discrimination piece to an under-responsivity piece. And so you want someone who can unpack that a bit for your child. If the child is you know, seeking the deep input and the crashing and everything because it helps them mediate how overwhelming the rest of their sensory systems are, then it's really important to unpack that. If the child's crashing and banging and falling and loves crashing on the ground because posturally they can't keep up against gravity, then the work you're going to be doing is going to be very different for them. So I would say that reading Dr. Lucy Miller's book would be a really great start. Carol Stock-Pranovitz, I've probably got them somewhere. So there's The Out of Sync Kid. That's a great one. There's No Longer a Secret. Yeah, she's fantastic. And then there's Sensational Kids as well. So they're all, you know, you can look through all of those and sort of, I think my kid fits this profile, and you could also do some screening questionnaires with someone as well. But often, you know, children do get put into sort of a catch-all. It's sensory. You can unpack it more than that and really give them tailored input when it's something that's so disordered and it's interfering their abilities to participate.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I see that one a lot. And then I also see the sensitivity to noise quite a bit. Seems very obvious, at least. And the other one then that's obvious when you're working with little kids is not wanting to touch things. So, no finger painting or slime.
And so with the sound one of the things I really loved about I found out that there was a bunch of schools in Switzerland, and they all had noise reduction ear headphones available in every classroom. So there were just 6, and they hung them on a string, and any kid who wanted them could get them. They'd really normalized that, you know, sometimes noise is too much. And so just normalizing the conversation and making these things available works really well. And then for kids who don't want to touch, grading that, so giving them tools to use and putting a cloth nearby them, again, like you said before, not just throwing them in and you'll be fine, just get dirty, but letting them go in piece by piece, and then modeling how fun it is to put your whole hand in there or your whole arm in there or whatever.
Definitely.
Really helps.
No, definitely. I think that's very good, very helpful. So, and I definitely want to make sure we give parents the resources today. And I know you have a website, spdstar.org.
Right. And I can, if it would be helpful, I can send you the links to the books and some various other things.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'll be sure to include that information from you in the email with this interview, so that the listeners can find all that information. And I always like to ask, since this is a parenting series, you know, if you, knowing what you know about your background, if you were to give parents one piece of advice, something to think about, you know, when their kids are itty bitty, what would you have them work on or keep in mind? Or
I think thinking about the sensory experiences of the baby and how young infants and babies are feeling the world around them through their sensory systems, and some of them are naturally more over responsive, some are naturally more under responsive and or slow to warm up. And so thinking about accommodate your baby's different, they feel the world differently to you.
Right.
I think that would be the main thing, is just how is your baby feeling the world, and what can you do to help them stay organized as they experience it in that way.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I like that. Definitely always trying to see the point of view of the child, right? And
Yeah.
meet them where they're at and try
Yeah.
to, I mean, you know, in the classroom, we do that with things such as reading, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every kid's at their own developmental stage, whether it's socially, emotionally, academically, physically. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's a great point. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Virginia.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be sure to have all the links in the email with this interview so that parents can find the resources to, you know, if they're concerned about something, they can maybe find some of the checklists and find some books or some other places to reach out. Because I think, you know, as much as we try to get the message out, it's still somewhat of a obscure topic sometimes.
Right.
So yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for chatting. And
It was a pleasure.
yeah, thank you. All right. Have a good day.